Hello, seniors. Hopefully, a quick move through chapter 20. Sorry for getting this one out. Not last night, but tonight, day off. But either way, we're going to move through this quickly. This is an important chapter because, of course, it's the death of Brother Todd Clifton, and Clifton's death propels really the rest of the book and a lot of the narrator's growing disenchantment with the Brotherhood, not just with how they treated Clifton, because I think we realize that the narrator has his own qualms with Clifton in this chapter, but also because he sees the Brotherhood as cutting ties with Harlem and ultimately being disinterested in actually helping people like him and people like Mary, people like those around him. That again, Ellison's disillusionment with the Communist Party bleeds through constantly in these sorts of chapters. No pun intended. That wasn't a morbid pun about Clifton. Anyways, we'll move through quickly. So first we have the narrator in the bar here, another bar scene, and of course the previous one that I think was important and noteworthy was him visiting that bar with Jack when he's initiated into the Brotherhood. This one clearly shows a dramatic shift from that sort of situation. Oh, you know how it is, brother. Things are tight and lots of folks who got jobs through you have lost them. You know how it goes. You mean people in our organization? Quite a few of them are. Fellows like Brother Maceo. But why? They were doing all right. Sure they was, as long as you people was fighting for them. But the minute y'all stopped, they started throwing folks out on the street. So I'm going to harp one more time here at least on the pronouns. Barrel House is describing the Brotherhood, and the narrator is they and you all. And I think there's that sense of us versus them, and suddenly the Brotherhood is them, and people like Barrel House, Brother Maceo, the couple being evicted a few chapters ago, are the us. And this is the first real inclination the narrator gets that something's gone wrong in Harlem and that the Brotherhood is willing to sacrifice it to further what they see as more global or even more selfish values. But we see that if things got good very quickly, things get bad very quickly. And I think, again, Ellison's sense of cynicism is that things get bad again a lot more quickly than they get good again. I'm sure we're feeling to some degree like this in the world right now with COVID-19 is a situation like that. I was reading a really depressing article about the plight of millennials in the Atlantic the other day. They were talking about how a lot of millennials, people older like me, born in the 80s, had huge financial crises and losses. 2008, 2009, when the recession hit, when the housing market collapsed, when there was the global meltdown of finance. And just as people are getting back on their feet, we had a stock market that was the highest it had ever been, well over 26,000 points. For the Dow Jones Industrial Average, by all accounts, the highest the stock market had been. We get hit with, if not a recession, some dramatic economic contraction here. And so I think Ellison is somebody who says, be realistic, be hopeful, don't give up that part of yourself, but be aware that the minute you stop keeping an eye on things and the minute you stop making sure that people are good, they're going to go bad. And I think we see that at least with the Brotherhood. And the narrator perhaps is largely naive still at this point. He seems surprised in a sense that the Brotherhood is walking away from Harlem. All right, so next quote here. As for the loss of membership and influence, it was a result of a new program which had called for the shelving of our old techniques of agitation. There had been, to my surprise, a switch in the emphasis from local issues to those more national and international in scope, and it was felt that for the moments the interests of Harlem were not of first importance. I didn't know what to make of it since there had been no such change of program downtown. Again, I think we see Ellison saying the nature of organizations, be it the college, be it Liberty Paints, be it the Brotherhood, these different kind of monoliths of society in this book, they perhaps start off local, but in a sad sort of way, the trend is always to get bigger and more dramatic. And a lot of times, going back to this earlier quote, the shift to kind of the attention you get on a national or world stage, the clout you get on a national or world stage is so kind of seductive that keeping focused on the local issues, the hard day-to-day work of making a real person's life better rather than, perhaps grandstanding or using the pulpit, but that this is something that's difficult. And we see again that the Brotherhood hasn't even told the narrator or the downtown office or Harlem, but it just makes an announcement that the interests of Harlem were not of first importance. And again, I think we see Ellison's cynicism with that groups will kind of be pandered to, groups will be courted politically or socially until the larger group gets what they want, the buy-in or the cooperation or the support or the endorsement, whatever it may be, and then it shifts. Not necessarily me saying that, Ellison. All right, so moving on here. Not you, I began. His eyes looked past me deliberately unseeing. I was paralyzed looking at him, knowing I wasn't dreaming. Hearing he's more than a toy, ladies and gentlemen. He's Sambo, the dancing doll, the 20th century miracle. Look at that Roomba, that's Susie Q. He's Sambo Boogie, Sambo Woogie. You don't have to feed him. He sleeps collapsed. He'll kill your depression and your dispossession. He lives upon the sunshine of your lordly smile. This, of course, is Clifton now, not just selling the doll, but doing this whole sales routine, selling the doll. He's selling a doll that's a doll of a character and a kind of offensive black stereotype called Sambo. I would encourage you to look it up on Wikipedia. It's obviously distressing like any other symbol of racism or hate, but it's one that survived, I think it survived far later than it should have, period, but it survived in the names of restaurants into the 60s and 70s, and it's just this kind of exaggerated image of blackness, and again, one that's been used as a racist symbol since its publication. So I think we see Clifton, of course, selling this doll, and the narrator is upset. Not you, I began. He saw Clifton as a hero, maybe the best version of himself, maybe the best version of blackness, period. There's that moment where when Clifton enters the Brotherhood offices for the first time, everybody's breath is taken away, kind of including the narrators, by how good looking he is and how confident he is. And I think one of the ironies here is that the narrator sees Clifton and is infuriated by this, but Clifton doesn't see the narrator. Yet again, he's invisible. Clifton is deliberately unseeing him. And again, I think going back to these earlier quotes, it's Clifton rejecting the Brotherhood, and if the narrator is going to be a true believer of the Brotherhood, Clifton now rejects him. The same way that the narrator is rejecting Clifton, if Clifton's going to, in his eyes, cooperate with these stereotypes. Either way, moving on. And the description here, you don't have to feed him. He sleeps collapsed. He'll kill your depression and your dispossession. He lives upon the sunshine of your lordly smile. I think we can read that and we can say, okay, that's the kind of continuation of the stereotype of submission, of inferiority, of servitude, of even slavery. We could say that these seem like the things here. But we're going to see that Clifton, almost like the discussion, I think, of the narrator when he's eating the yam and he's having that moment where he's saying, why am I not allowed to eat this? Isn't it terrible that a stereotype that's been created that I was never a part of prevents me from kind of taking the actions I genuinely want to take? Not necessarily saying that this is exactly the same, but I think the narrator is upset with Clifton's choice here, choice to sell the doll, choice to perhaps play into that stereotype by doing this spiel or being seen with it. Excuse me. And I think we see the narrator oscillate again. If he was in a moment where he was willing to accept anybody and respect any decision that they made, back with the yams and the chitterlings, he's suddenly again judgmental, and he's saying it's not just about what you want, it's about kind of what makes the larger community look a certain way, and there are rules outside of us you have to play by when you do that. All right. For a second, our eyes met, and he gave me a contemptuous smile. Then he spieled again. I felt betrayed. I looked at the doll and felt my throat constrict. The rage welled, behind the phlegm. As I rocked back on my heels and crouched forward, there was a flash of whiteness and a splatter like heavy rain striking a newspaper, and I saw the doll go over backwards, wilting into a dripping rag of frilled tissue, the hateful head upturned on its outstretched neck, still grinning toward the sky. The crowd turned on me indignantly. You'll probably notice here that so much of this description is foreshadowing Clifton's own death. And I think in this scene, the narrator is taking the position of the cop, and Clifton is taking the position of the doll. The narrator gets frustrated by what he represents, by what he's doing to the community, and he actually, like a runner, rocked back on his heels and crouched forward. Clifton's described as kind of taking the stance of a sprinter when he's trying to get away from the cop. The doll goes over backwards, wilting into a dripping rag of frilled tissue, the hateful head upturned on its outstretched neck, still grinning towards the sky. Again, I think it's just a symbol here, and Ellison, not just foreshadowing, but again complicating the idea. The shooting of Clifton was white versus black. Perhaps it was that, perhaps, racial tensions and racism had a large part in that. But I think Ellison's constantly saying just because you share a trait with somebody, there's no trait in life, except maybe just humanity, that will bond one person to another, period. And maybe even humanity doesn't do that all the time. Obviously we have horrific examples from human history of where humanity was shrugged off at the first opportunity. But the idea that because the narrator's black and Clifton's black, the narrator's in Harlem, Clifton's in Harlem, they worked for the Brotherhood, that somehow these are going to allow one man to kind of look past the perceived faults of the other. That's not the case. And so I think Ellison is clever in having the narrator kind of do the first killing here and have that guilt on him and his blood on his hands all the way up through the end of the chapter, when the narrator is grappling, I think, with his responsibility to himself and his responsibility to those around him. So what happened to Clifton? It was all so wrong, so unexpected. How on earth could he drop from Brotherhood to this in so short a time? And why, if he had to fall back, did he try to carry the whole structure with him? What would non-members who knew him say? It was as though he had chosen, how had he put it, the night he fought with Raz, to fall outside of history. I stopped in the middle of the block with the thought to plunge, he had said. But he knew that only in the Brotherhood could we make ourselves known, could we avoid being empty Sambo dolls, such an obscene flouncing of everything human. My God. So, again, this kind of endless criticism of Clifton's choices, Clifton's shame that he's brought on everybody. I think we constantly see this idea. I think one of the earliest places we see it is True Blood, and Clifton, in a sense, being to the narrator what True Blood was to the college. That why, if he had to fall back, did he try to carry the whole structure with him? That somebody like Clifton, through their actions, through their words, through their willingness or perceived choice to play into a stereotype, is somebody who's done irreparable harm to the community of black men and women, to the community of Southern blacks, to the community of the Brotherhood, whatever community you want to place onto that. But the narrator's critical, and I think we've seen him suddenly fall back into a power structure like the college, that had he stayed at the college and even gone through these same experiences, he would be standing up, giving the loudest speech against True Blood. Not that True Blood's, any sort of kind of commendable human being, but that the narrator sees True Blood's choices as not just True Blood's choices and True Blood's wrongs. It's that bleeds through, and that then becomes the narrator's wrongs, and his resent is for anybody who's dismantling the group through these kinds of choices. I think in a way, True Blood also falls outside of history, not just because he's outside of college, but because he's in these slave quarters or old slave quarters, the cabins, and so. Excuse me. I think we get back to that idea in the last chapter of civilization, even over civilization, and then being outside of history. And we've talked in class about that deal you make with any social group, that you're going to put aside some of who you were before them, some of what you thought before them, some of what you did before them to become part of that group. And for most groups that we join in life, that's a deal we're pretty aware of, and often a deal we're pretty willing to make. But it's something that the narrator, believes is a better deal than having personal freedom, even the freedom to support racism, even the freedom to sell a doll like the Sambo doll, even the freedom to, I don't want to go into True Blood, but the narrator says the better deal is always society. I don't think Ellison is telling us True Blood somehow found the right deal, but I think Ellison is saying if we're going to judge, we have to be careful to figure out if we're judging because we in our hearts truly think something is wrong, or if we're judging because we feel like that person is reflecting poorly on us as a group, and we're going to come down so harshly that the group is kind of redeemed and can keep moving by casting that person out. All right. So I could see the cop push Clifton again, the two moving in a kind of march. Excuse me. That I had seen many times, but never with anyone like Clifton. His left arm followed through in a floating uppercut that had sent the cop's cap sailing into the street, and his feet flying to drop him hard, rocking from left to right on the walk, as Clifton kicked the box, thudding aside, and crouched, his left foot forward, his hands high, waiting. I heard rapid explosions and saw each pigeon diving wildly as though blackjack by the sound, and the cop sitting up straight now and rising to his knees, looking steadily at Clifton, and the pigeons plummeting swiftly into the trees, and Clifton still facing the cop and suddenly crumpling. A lot going on here. In terms of the literal scene, it seems as though Clifton was running away from the cop spins him in the process of being spun, and I think it's an open question. Clifton's arm flies forward and uppercuts the officer and sends his cap sailing into the street and basically knocks him to the ground. And we can ask whether or not Clifton actually meant to punch the cop or if he was just spun and his arm flew out, and that was the process of momentum. But ultimately it's unimportant because it's the perception of the action rather than the intention that I think gets Clifton killed here. So Clifton gets shot, and interestingly, Ellison, I think, is a little vague on this. I heard rapid explosions. He doesn't say the cop shot Clifton. Maybe that's just too easy for Ellison. Maybe it's not interesting to phrase it that way. But Clifton is shot and killed, and we have this scene afterwards where it's both incredibly dramatic and in a sense drawn out. You were probably a bit exhausted by how long and endless these sentences are, but at the same time, something that happens in a moment. We're kind of trying to wrap our heads around exactly what just happened. I think Ellison is a master at creating that sense of a moment lasting forever, and then the moment after it seeming like only an instant. So I looked back to Clifton. The cop was waving me away with his gun, sounding like a boy with changing voice. Get back on the other side, he said. He was the cop that I'd passed on 43rd a few minutes before. My mouth was dry. He's a friend of mine. I want to help, I said, finally stepping upon the curb. You don't need no help, Junior. Get across that street. I'm his friend, I said. The one making notes looked up. He's a cooked pigeon, Mac, he said. You ain't got any friend anymore. The biggest development here is that the narrator says something I think we've been waiting the whole book for him to say in the tragedies. He says it too late, but he says he's a friend of mine. We remember that he said Mary wasn't exactly his friend. Even at these moments where he basically says nobody's going to get close to him because he's been betrayed so many times. And this is an incredibly important part because he claims Clifton as a friend. And then he reverses it. His first one is, he's a friend of mine. The subject here being Clifton, and the object kind of being the narrator. And then he flips it. I'm his friend. So, we could talk about the sentence structure. The first one is Clifton doing an action, Clifton having the narrator as a friend. The second one, the narrator claiming Clifton as a friend. But either way, it's something that is really dramatic. And again, tragically too late, the narrator says he has a friend. That Clifton actually was this person who was close to him. And I think, again, that's a moment of the narrator's redemption. He wanted to hurt Clifton when he saw him with the Sambo doll, but now in this moment where he realized death can seem so random or so unpredictable or so inevitable or so evil, that holding those sorts of things suddenly becomes, if not unimportant, something to be considered second to friends. It reminds me of George Orwell wrote an article, I don't remember if our class who read it or not, about Gandhi. And it's a really interesting article because Orwell says Gandhi basically tried too hard to be a good person, in the sense that he subjected his family and followers to advice that could have produced physical harm, could have produced their death. This is Orwell saying this. And Orwell says, being a friend is putting aside society's rules from time to time to stick with the person you know is wrong because you're their friend. I think Ellison would very much appreciate Orwell's ideas on that sort of thing, or at least the narrator would. The narrator seems to agree that part of having friends is siding with them over society from time to time. All right, so why should a man deliberately plunge outside of history and peddle in obscenity? My mind went on abstractly. Why should he choose to disarm himself, give up his voice, and leave the only organization offering him a chance to define himself? Why had he turned away? Why had he chosen to step off the platform and fall beneath the train? Why did he choose to plunge into nothingness, into the void of faceless faces, of soundless voices lying outside history? The narrator clearly still grappling with who he thought Clifton was, what he saw Clifton selling, and how he feels about Clifton now that Clifton's died. He does describe the Brotherhood as the only organization offering him a chance to define himself. And again, I think that this is evidence of kind of the narrator's immaturity, or if not immaturity, kind of naivete when it comes to believing that organizations can help you and large social groups have your best interest as an individual at heart. Clifton clearly didn't feel like the Brotherhood was what defined him. Clifton, I think, in that moment right before he died, was somebody who had a total disregard for history and a total disregard for society, that he didn't care who was with him and who was against him and who thought he was doing the right thing and who thought he was doing the wrong thing. He was, in the most Emersonian way, himself. And the narrator still can't fully get to the point where he embraces Clifton for that. But again, it's the idea of why did he choose to plunge into nothingness, into the void of faceless faces, of soundless voices lying outside history. So why did Clifton decide to not become the person he had the potential for? In a way, kind of Mr. Norton's dream of people, that the black men and women he worked with at the college would become famous like Booker T. Washington and raise their race up and improve their race. I think the narrator's still in the mindset that not only is that possible, but that's a very good thing. That's something to be worked towards rather than just being kind of yourself, warts and all. And I think Ellison is skeptical of not the idea of self-improvement or even social improvement, but the idea that that's what everybody feels obligated to do because of who they are. So Clifton lying outside history, in a sense, says he won't be recorded, but there's a power in that, I think, in Ellison's story. Not being recorded means you were truly an individual. You got to be yourself. I think we can even think of 1984. Um, of course, Winston is wiped out, from the memory of the party and the memory of the world. If we assume that, the appendix isn't saying the world got better afterwards, but he says that his power, when he's towards the end of his time in the Ministry of Love, would be to die hating them. Even though he's never going to be remembered, even though he's never going to be able to tell anybody about his feelings, he's able to feel it, and the party doesn't control him. And of course, the terror of that book is they do get inside his head and make him accept the party, and he dies not outside of history, but inside of history. I think Ellison is saying, being outside of history, you don't get, the kudos of being remembered or being talked about a day later, a year later, 100 years later, 1,000 years later, but you get to do whatever you want. And for Ellison, that is a harder decision to make between which one's the right one than I think a lot of other writers and thinkers and just people in general would say. All right, so moving on. Now moving through the crowds along 125th Street, I was painfully aware of other men dressed like the boys, and of girls in dark exotic colored stockings, their costumes, surreal variations of downtown styles. They'd been there all along, but somehow I'd missed them. I'd missed them even when my work had been most successful. They were outside the groove of history, and it was my job to get them in, all of them. I looked in the design of their faces, hardly a one that was unlike someone I'd known down south. And so I think that this is the turning of the narrator, that he's finally starting to accept people as people, not whether they're part of the Brotherhood, not whether they accept the ideas of the college, not whether they agree with his views on race, but that they're people like Mary, neighbors, kind people, people nearby, people who make an impact on your life. And he's realizing that, like the Brotherhood, seeing things only nationally or internationally, when you do that, you block out the people immediately in front of you. The narrator has that realization. I think he's still grappling with it. They were outside the groove of history, and it was my job to get them in, all of them. Maybe he's saying that a bit critically about himself and his job. He doesn't think that necessarily that was a good thing for him to feel or for him to try and do. But he realizes that he'd missed the people there, and that ultimately the people are like the people down south. I don't think he means black. I don't think he means Southern. I don't think he means eating a breakfast of grits. I think he means the people he saw the humanity in day over day over day, the people closest to him, his family, his friends. And again, I think he says that a big part of becoming an adult, and especially becoming part of an organization, is that you forget or deny that there's humanity in everyone around you. All right, so moving on, a pressure of guilt came over me. I stood on the edge of the walk, watching the crowd, threatening to attack the man until a policeman appeared and dispersed them. And although I knew one man could do much about it, I felt responsible. All our work had been very little, no great change had been made, and it was all my fault. I'd been so fascinated by the motion that I'd forgotten to measure what it was bringing forth. I'd been asleep dreaming. This is a really important scene, and unfortunately I had to cut the quote short just because Ellison drew it out over so many words, although they were beautiful words, of the man who has stolen something from the store. The cops are chasing him, and he runs by the narrator, and the narrator considers for a moment, maybe I should kick out my foot and trip him so that the cops can catch up with him. And the narrator says, no, I'm not going to do that. And as he's kind of thinking, as the man passes him by and he doesn't trip him, there is this woman who sticks out her foot and trips the man, this just resident out and about. And so again, we have all these kind of emotions colliding with each other. A pressure of guilt came over the narrator. I think first, perhaps, that he didn't stop the man when he could have. I'm reminded of the beginning of at least the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, where he lets, and I'm not giving anything away, this is like the first 5 minutes of the first one, he lets the guy who, I think he robbed somebody, I think it was now I'm vamping, the wrestling match that Spider-Man is in, or Peter Parker's in at first, and he lets the man escape, and ultimately, by letting that man escape, he ends up killing Peter Parker's Uncle Ben, and Peter Parker has the guilt. He's kind of always working out as Spider-Man. I don't know if that's probably a connection other people have made, but I'm pretty proud of it. Anyways, the narrator goes through the same thing. He lets the man run, and then he realizes he had an opportunity in that moment to do something to perhaps improve the community, to perhaps do the right thing, and he lets it pass, and the pressure of guilt comes over him. But I think the narrator then takes that moment and kind of blows it up and says that's what the Brotherhood is. Working in the Brotherhood, all our work had been very little, no great change had been made, that he had so many opportunities to maybe say something or do something or ask a question or work on behalf of somebody or mention a name, and in terms of just kind of playing along, getting ahead, being everybody's friend, he didn't do those things. And I think he feels like suddenly in this moment, that's a fault, to kind of stay quiet, to never act, to never truly care about the people around you, that's bad. And it's especially bad if you're doing it for selfish reasons, for kind of an oversized sense of ambition. If you're so fascinated by the motion that you've forgotten to measure what it was bringing forth, that you're simply enjoying the ride and you don't care where it ends up. For the narrator, clearly, he's got a bit of blood on his hands as far as Harlem falling apart. He worked with the Brotherhood. He was their face. He was their voice. And now that they've betrayed Harlem, he has too. He has to deal with that legacy. So he's definitely working with that and trying to make sense of it. All right, so we'll end there. I will try to get 21 out tomorrow night. We, believe it or not, are on track to still finish here, and I look forward to it. I will tell